Ambassador Kira Vasquez stood alone in the observation lounge of Nexus Station and watched the endless dance of starships outside the massive windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, like sheets of pure darkness dotted with lights. She had been stationed here for 6 months now, and she still could not get used to the sight of so many alien vessels moving through space like fish swimming through a dark ocean. The station itself was enormous, and it served as a meeting point for dozens of species from across the galaxy who came here to trade and negotiate, and sometimes to avoid wars that might destroy entire star systems. Behind her, the door slid open with a soft hiss, and she heard the clicking sound of her liaison approaching. Counselor Thrix was a Vellani, and his species looked somewhat like tall insects with shiny green shells and large compound eyes that reflected light in strange ways. He moved on 4 legs and used his upper 2 limbs like arms, and his mandibles clicked together when he was nervous, which happened quite often around Kira, Ambassador Vasquez. He said in his buzzing voice that the translator device turned into words she could understand. "I must speak with you about the delegation that arrives today." Kira turned away from the window and gave him her full attention because Thrix was usually calm and professional, and the nervous clicking of his mandibles told her something serious was happening. "The Krevith," she said. "Yes," Thrix confirmed, and his compound eyes blinked rapidly, which was another sign of his distress. "The Krevith delegation will arrive within the hour, and there are things you must understand about them before they come." Kira already knew the basics from her briefing files, but she nodded for him to continue because local knowledge was always more valuable than reports written by people who had never actually met the species in question. "The Krevith are apex predators," Thrix began, and his voice dropped lower as if he was afraid someone might hear him. "They evolved on a death world where everything was trying to kill everything else, and they came out on top by being the most dangerous thing on their planet. I read the reports," Kira said. 7 feet tall on average, with scales and claws and teeth designed for tearing through flesh. "The reports do not capture what it feels like to be in a room with them," Thrix said, and he shuddered visibly. "They conquered 3 star systems before joining the Galactic Concordat, and they only joined because continuing to fight would have cost them too much. They sound lovely," Kira said with a small smile. Thrix did not understand human humor, and he continued without acknowledging her comment. "They have requested to bring their young with them," he said, and this time his mandibles clicked so rapidly it sounded like a rattle. "A cub will accompany the warlord and his mate." Kira raised an eyebrow because bringing children to diplomatic meetings was unusual for most species. "Is that normal for them?" she asked. "It is a test," Thrix explained. "The Krevith believe that you can judge a species by how they react to their young, and their cubs are not like the children of other species." He paused and seemed to gather his courage before continuing. "Krevith cubs are feral by design," he said. "The Krevith do not coddle their offspring or protect them from danger because they believe that such treatment creates weakness, and they want their children to be strong. So the cub will be aggressive," Kira said. "The cub will be a predator," Thrix corrected her. "Small but deadly and completely untamed, and it will test everyone in the room to establish dominance." He leaned closer, and his voice became almost a whisper. "The last species to show fear before a Krevith cub was removed from diplomatic consideration," he said, permanently. Kira understood what he meant, and it was not a pleasant thought. "What exactly does the cub do?" she asked. "It will approach and it will threaten," Thrix said. "It will snarl and bare its teeth and make itself as frightening as possible, and if you run or cower or show submission, then the Krevith will decide that your species is prey and not worth their respect." "And if I stand my ground?" Thrix made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had not been so filled with despair. "No one stands their ground," he said. "The survival instincts of every species in the Concordat Tell them to flee from apex predators, and the Kravath know this, and they use it to establish their dominance over every negotiation. Kira turned back to the window and watched. A Kravath warship emerged from faster than light travel in a flash of distorted space. The ship was brutal and angular, and it looked exactly like what it was, which was a weapon of war designed to intimidate as much as to destroy. How many species have tried to stand their ground? She asked. Several. Thrix admitted. The Torvan warrior caste attempted it once, and their representative managed to hold position for almost 10 seconds before his instincts overwhelmed him. And he fled. 10 seconds, Kira repeated. It was considered very impressive. Thrix said. The Kravath respected the Torvan more after that, but they still see them as lesser beings. Kira watched the warship approach the station, and she thought about what Thrix had told her, and she thought about the history of her own. Species humans had faced predators before, and they had not always run. Counselor, she said, without turning around, I need you to tell me everything you know about Kravath body language and what their young respond to. Why? Thrix asked with confusion in his voice. Because I want to be prepared, Kira said. Prepared for what? Kira finally turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that made Thrix take an involuntary step backward, even though she was small and soft and had no claws or fangs or natural weapons of any kind. Prepared to make a good first impression, she said, and she smiled in a way that showed her teeth. Thrix felt a chill run through his exoskeleton, and for the first time since meeting the human ambassador, he wondered if perhaps the reports about her species had left out some very important information. The Kravath warship docked with the station, and somewhere in its depths a young predator prepared to meet its first human. Neither of them knew yet how much that meeting would change everything. The diplomatic chamber was designed to be neutral territory where no species would feel more comfortable than any other. But Kira thought that was impossible because some species were simply more intimidating than others. Representatives from 8 different civilizations had gathered for this meeting, and they stood in small groups around the circular room while servants brought drinks and food suited to each species. The Mallory delegation clustered near the far wall, and their bright feathers were puffed up, and what Kira had learned was a display of anxiety rather than aggression. The Grothian ambassador floated in a tank of nutrient liquid, and its many eye stalks swiveled constantly as it watched everything happening around it. 2 members of the Torvan warrior caste stood near the main entrance, and their muscular frames and ceremonial weapons were meant to project strength. But Kira noticed how they kept glancing at the door. Everyone was waiting for the Kravath counselor Thrix. Had positioned himself as far from the entrance as physically possible while still remaining in the room, and Kira did not blame him for that. She had chosen to stand in the center of the chamber, where she would be clearly visible to anyone entering. Ambassador Vasquez, the Mallory representative called out in his musical voice. Perhaps you would be more comfortable standing with us near the refreshment area. I am comfortable here, Kira replied. But thank you for the offer. The Mallory exchanged glances that Kira could not read, but she suspected they thought she was either very brave or very foolish. The door opened, and everyone in the room stopped breathing. Warlord Kethrak entered first, and he was everything the reports had described and more. He stood 8 feet tall, and his scales were dark green with patches of black that Kira suspected were old scars from battles he had fought and won. His eyes were gold and slitted like a reptile, and they scanned the room with cold intelligence. That missed nothing. Behind him came his mate Cyravan, and she was slightly smaller, but no less dangerous, with her claws painted red in the Kravath fashion that indicated she had killed enemies in personal combat. But it was the small figure between them that drew everyone's attention. Rix was the warlord's cub, and he was only 4 feet tall, which made him small by Kravath standards, but he was still larger than many of the other species present. His scales were a lighter green than his father's, and they had not yet darkened with age, but his claws were already sharp, and his teeth were already prominent in his young face. His yellow eyes moved around the room with predatory focus, and Kira could see him cataloging every person present, and deciding whether they were threats or prey. The Mallory ambassador's feathers went flat against his body in an instinctive display of submission. The Grothian's eye stalks all pointed downward, which was their species' way of avoiding confrontation. Even the Torvan warriors shifted their weight backward, as if preparing to retreat despite their training and their weapons and their pride. Kira remained exactly where she stood. Warlord Kethrak noticed her immediately, and his golden eyes narrowed. With something that might have been curiosity or might have been the look a predator gives unusual prey. Human. He rumbled, and his voice was deep and resonant like distant thunder. "You do not retreat. Should I?" Kira asked, and her voice was calm and steady. The warlord did not answer, but his head tilted slightly to one side as he studied her more carefully than he had studied anyone else in the room. "I am Warlord Kethrak of the Third Fleet," he announced to the assembly while still watching Kira. "I speak for the Kraveth Dominion in matters of trade and alliance. Welcome to Nexus Station," the Grothian ambassador said through its translator. "We are honored by your presence." Kethrak ignored the floating creature entirely and continued to stare at the human, who had not moved and had not looked away and had not shown any of the fear responses that he expected. Beside him, Cyravan placed a clawed hand on their cub's shoulder and leaned down to whisper something in his ear. Rix looked at his mother, and then at the human, and then he smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a young predator who had just identified his next target. He pulled away from his mother's grip and began to walk toward Kira with slow, deliberate steps, and his claws clicked against the hard floor with each movement. The Mallory ambassador made a sound of distress and fled through a side door without any attempt at dignity. The Grothian's tank began moving backward on its automated treads as the creature inside tried to put distance between itself and what was about to happen. Even Councillor Thrix, who had promised to stay and support his human colleague, pressed himself against the wall and closed his compound eyes as if he could not bear to watch. Only the Torvan remained in place, and Kira could see that they were fighting their own instincts with every ounce of their considerable willpower. Rix continued his approach, and his eyes never left the human female who stood alone in the center of the room. He was close enough now that Kira could smell him, and he smelt like copper and something musky and wild. She could see the individual scales on his face and the way his pupils dilated as he prepared himself for whatever was about to happen. The young Kraveth stopped 3 feet away from her and drew himself up to his full height, which brought his eyes level with her chest. Then he opened his mouth and revealed rows of teeth that were designed to tear through flesh and bone, and he began to snarl. The sound that came from the young Kraveth was unlike anything Kira had ever heard before, and it resonated through the diplomatic chamber like a physical force. It started low and deep in his chest and built in intensity until it filled the entire room with a primal warning that spoke directly to the oldest and most primitive parts of every brain present. This was not just noise, and it was not just a threat. This was a sound that had been perfected over millions of years of evolution to trigger one specific response in any creature that heard it run or die. The Villani delegation had already fled, and now the remaining Mallory followed them through any exit they could find, while their bright feathers left a trail behind them like colorful snow. The Grothian ambassador's tank moved so quickly toward the door that it crashed into a refreshment table and sent drinks flying across the floor, but the creature inside did not care because escape was the only thing that mattered. One of the Torvan warriors dropped his ceremonial weapon and ran, and his companion followed a moment later, despite the shame that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Councillor Thrix was the last to leave, and Kira saw him hesitate at the doorway with his compound eyes fixed on her in what might have been apology. or might have been farewell. Then his survival instincts won the battle against his loyalty, and he was gone. Kira stood alone in the diplomatic chamber with the young predator 3 feet in front of her, and his parents watching from across the room with cold interest. Rix's snarl had not stopped, and if anything it grew more intense when he saw that everyone else had fled. His yellow eyes were fixed on her face, and his lips were pulled back so far that she could see the pink gums above his teeth. The muscles in his shoulders and legs were coiled and ready to spring, and Kira knew from her briefing that a Kravath cub could move faster than any human and could strike with enough force to break bones. This was the final warning before an attack, and every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run just like everyone else had run. But Kira Vasquez had grown up on a farm in Montana where the winters were harsh and the wildlife was dangerous, and her grandfather had taught her something important when she was just a little girl. He had taught her the predators could sense fear, and that running from them was often the worst thing you could do. So she did not run, she did not step backward, she did not look away from those yellow predator eyes. Instead, she took a slow breath and let it out and waited for her heart to stop racing quite so fast. Rix's snarl faltered for just a moment when he saw that his prey was not behaving like prey was supposed to behave. He had done this before with other species, and they had always run. And he did not understand why this small, soft creature with no claws and no fangs was still standing there looking at him. He increased the volume of his snarl and lowered his head and raised the scales along his spine in a display that was meant to make him look larger and more threatening. Kira watched him do this, and she found herself thinking that he was actually quite beautiful in a terrifying sort of way. His scales caught the light and shimmered with hints of blue and gold beneath the green, and his eyes were bright with intelligence, despite the aggression he was displaying. He reminded her of the mountain lions that had sometimes come down from the hills near her family's farm, and she remembered how her grandfather had dealt with them. Fascinating, she said softly. The word was so unexpected that Rix's snarl stopped completely for a moment before he caught himself and started again. But there was confusion in his eyes now, and his aggressive posture had lost some of its certainty. Across the room, Warlord Kethrak and his mate exchanged a glance that carried meaning. Kira could not read the Warlord's golden eyes had narrowed further, and he was watching the human with an intensity that had nothing to do with the test his son was conducting. Siravan size claws had extended slightly and then retracted, which Kira's briefing had told her was a sign of emotional uncertainty among the Kravath Rix made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a cough, and it was clear that he did not know what to do with a creature that would not react the way creatures were supposed to react. He took a step closer and lowered his body into a crouch that was the final position before a pounce, and his muscles trembled with the effort of holding back the attack. This was it. This was the moment when every other species had finally broken and fled. Kira looked at the young predator, crouching before her with his teeth bared and his claws ready, as she made a decision that would be discussed in xenobiology courses and diplomatic academies for centuries to come. She crouched down to his eye level and looked directly into those yellow predator eyes, and she smiled. It was a genuine smile that reached her eyes and crinkled the corners of her face and showed her own teeth, which were small and flat and completely unsuited for tearing flesh. Rix froze in place, and his snarl died in his throat, because no creature had ever done this before. No creature had ever looked at him and smiled. His yellow eyes were wide with something that might have been shock, or might have been fear, or might have been the first stirring of an emotion he had never felt before: curiosity. Kira remained crouched at the young Kravath's eye level, and she could see the confusion spreading across his scaled face like ripples in a pond. His aggressive posture had collapsed entirely, and he stood there with his claws still extended, but his teeth no longer bared, and his eyes blinking rapidly as he tried to understand what was happening. "You are trying to scare me," Kira said in a warm voice that held no trace of fear or anger. "It is a very good snarl, and I can see that you have practiced it many times." Rix made a small sound in his throat that was nothing like the terrifying rumble he had produced before, and his head tilted to one side the same way his father's had done earlier. "But here is the thing, little one," Kira continued as she reached slowly into the pocket of her diplomatic uniform. "On my world, we have predators too." She pulled out a small flat device and tapped its surface, and a holographic image appeared in the air between them. It showed a human child who could not have been more than 5 years old, sitting in green grass beside an enormous animal with thick fur and a long snout and teeth that were clearly visible in its open mouth. The animal was easily 3 times the size of the child, and its jaws were large enough to crush bone. But the little girl had her arms wrapped around its neck, and she was laughing. Rix stared at the image with his yellow eyes wide and unblinking. "We call them dogs now," Kira said. "But 10,000 years ago, they were wolves, and wolves were pack hunters who could chase their prey for hours without tiring and bring down animals 10 times their own size." She changed the image, and now it showed a different human, with a sleek spotted creature draped across their lap like a living blanket. "These are cats," she said. "They are ambush predators with claws that retract into their paws and reflexes faster than any human can match. And they can see in darkness that would blind us completely." Another image appeared showing a human standing beside an enormous creature with 4 legs and a flowing mane and hooves that looked like they could shatter stone. "Horses," Kira explained. "They can run faster than we can and kick with enough force to cave in a skull, and yet we learn to climb on their backs. And they carry us wherever we want to go." Rix had stopped making any sound at all, and his eyes moved from one image to the next with an expression that Kira could only describe as wonder. She showed him hawks with talons like knives and falcons that could dive faster than any vehicle, and eagles large enough to carry off small prey in their claws. She showed him bears that towered over humans when they stood on their hind legs, and great cats with teeth like daggers, and snakes that could kill with a single bite. "Do you know what we did when we saw all these predators?" Kira asked, and she leaned closer to the young Kravith as if sharing a secret. "We did not run from them." Rix's voice came out as barely a whisper, and it was the first word he had spoken since entering the chamber. "What did you do?" Kira smiled again, and it was the smile of someone sharing a wonderful truth. "We befriended them," she said. "We looked at the most dangerous creatures we could find, and we said to ourselves that we wanted them to be our companions." She showed another image, and this one made Rix take an involuntary step backward. It was a human sitting in what looked like a pool of water, and wrapped around them was an enormous serpent with scales that gleamed in shades of gold and brown, and its body was thick enough that a Kravith cub could not have wrapped his arms around it. The human was smiling and scratching the serpent under its chin, and the serpent's eyes were half closed in what was clearly pleasure. "My species does not run from predators, little one," Kira said, and her voice was gentle, but there was something underneath it that made Warlord Ketherick shift his weight from one foot to the other. "We adopt them." Rix looked at the human female who had not run from him and had not shown fear, and had not submitted, and he felt something changing inside himself. All his life he had been taught that strength was the only thing that mattered, and that other species were either threats to be destroyed or prey to be consumed. But this creature was neither of those things. She was something new and something strange, and something that made him feel emotions he did not have names for. "You befriended predators," he said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense. "We did more than that," Kira said, and she closed the holographic display and looked directly into his eyes. "We brought them into our homes, and we let them sleep beside our children. And we trusted them with our lives." She reached out her hand slowly with her palm facing upward, and her fingers relaxed, and she held it in the space between them like an offering. and they trusted us in return. Rick stared at her hand, and he could see that her skin was soft and vulnerable, and her fingers had no claws, and there was nothing about her that should make him hesitate. But he hesitated anyway, because something told him that what happened next would matter more than anything that had happened before. Behind him, his parents stood in absolute silence and watched their son face a choice that no Kravith cub had ever faced before, the choice between being a predator and being something more. The diplomatic chamber was silent, except for the soft hum of the station's life support systems, and Rick stood frozen in place with his yellow eyes fixed on the human's outstretched hand. He had never been offered anything like this before among his own kind. Touching was something that happened during combat, or during the private moments between family members, and it was never offered to strangers. But this human was offering her hand to him as if it was the most natural thing in the world, and there was no fear in her eyes, and no tension in her body, and no sign that she expected him to hurt. Rick looked back at his parents and saw something on his father's face that he had never seen before. The warlord was uncertain. Kethrak had lived for over 200 cycles, and he had conquered worlds and defeated enemies beyond counting, and he had never once been uncertain about anything. But now he stood in a diplomatic chamber, watching his cub interact with an alien creature. And he did not know what was happening, or what it meant. Sci-Fi had placed her clawed hand on her mate's arm and her own expression was a mixture of confusion and something that might have been hope. Rick turned back to the human and made a decision. He leaned forward and sniffed her hand the way he would sniff anything new and unfamiliar. She smelled strange but not unpleasant, and there was something underneath the surface scent that reminded him of the warmth of his mother's scales when he was very small. Then slowly and hesitantly, and with his heart beating faster than they had ever beat before, he pressed his scaled head against her palm. Sci-Fi gasped, and it was a sound that no Kravith was supposed to make in public because it revealed too much emotion. Kethrak made no sound at all, but his golden eyes went wide and his claws extended slightly before he caught himself and forced them back. The bonding gesture, the warlord whispered, and his voice was rough with shock. He has never done that before. Kira understood the significance of what had happened, even though she did not fully understand the details, and she responded to it with instincts that were older than civilization. She gently scratched behind the cub's ear ridge and found the spot where his scales were thinner and more sensitive, and she moved her fingers in slow circles. Rick's eyes half closed, and a sound began to build in his chest that was completely different from the snarl he had produced earlier. It was a rumble that vibrated through his entire body, and it expressed contentment and safety and belonging. And it was a sound that Kravith cubs normally only made with their parents. "He is purring," Sci-Fi said, and her voice was filled with wonder. "I have never heard him purr for anyone outside our family." Kira continued to scratch the cub's ear ridge, and she looked up at the warlord and his mate with eyes that held no triumph and no superiority. "The Galactic Concordat has feared your species for centuries," she said, and her voice was calm and thoughtful. "They see predators when they look at you, and they see conquerors." Kethrak's expression hardened slightly, because he knew this was true, and he had always considered it a source of pride. "But I see something different," Kira continued. "I see a species that loves its children so fiercely that you bring them into uncertain situations rather than leave them alone." She looked down at Rick, who had pressed closer to her hand, and whose eyes were now completely closed. "I see a people who value strength because you had to be strong to survive on your world, but I also see a people who value family and loyalty and honor." She stood slowly, and Rick made a small sound of disappointment before he caught himself and tried to look dignified, which was difficult for someone whose ear ridges were still tingling with pleasure. "Humanity does not fear the Kravith," Kira said, and she met the warlord's golden eyes without flinching. "We recognize you. Recognize us," Kethrak repeated, and there was a question in his voice. "You are predators," Kira said, "and so are we, even though we do not look like it. And even though we hide it behind our soft skin and our small teeth." She smiled, and it was a different smile than the one she had given Rix. It was a smile that carried the weight of 10,000 years of human history and all the creatures that humanity had faced and befriended, and sometimes destroyed. "We are the species that looked at wolves and said we wanted to hunt beside them. And we are the species that looked at horses and said we wanted to run with them. And we are the species that looked at hawks and said we wanted to fly with them." Kethrak felt something shifting in his understanding of the galaxy, and he was not sure if he should be excited or afraid. "What do you want from us?" he asked. "We want to be friends," Kira said simply. "We want to know your stories and share ours, and we want to find out what our species can accomplish together." She extended her hand toward the warlord, the same way she'd extended it toward his son. "The Kravath have spent centuries being feared by everyone they met, but you have never met anyone who was not afraid of you before." Her smile widened until now. Kethrak looked at her hand, and then at his son, who was watching with bright yellow eyes, and then at his mate, who gave him a small nod. He had conquered worlds and defeated armies and survived challenges that would have killed any lesser being. But accepting the hand of friendship from a species that did not fear him was somehow harder than any of those things, and yet he reached out with his massive clawed hand and wrapped it gently around her small, soft fingers, and he felt the warmth of her skin against his scales. "Perhaps," he said, and his voice was thick with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "It is time the Kravath learned what friendship means." 3 years later, the first Kravath exchange student arrived on Earth, and she was terrified of the family dog until she learned to play fetch, and the galaxy was never quite the same again.